Okay, let's start. Thank you everybody for coming to this opening conference to the Congress in I+D+i Research and Development and Design of Technologies for the Equality. We are very honored to have here Judy Wajcman, that is she is Anthony Giddens Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics and a Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. She has published widely on the sociology of gender, work, temporality, as well as in science and technology studies. Two of her books have been translated also into Spanish. Her recent press for Time, The Acceleration of Life in Digital Capitalism, as Esclavos del Tiempo, and also Technofeminism as El Tecnofeminismo. We're very glad to have you here, Judy, and we are willing to hear you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now we can share the presentation, Marian, if you could.
Okay. Fabulous. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I've got a slight echo at my end, but it's all right. Your end? Yes, I think so. Okay. Thank you very much, Celia, for the introduction, and I'm so happy to be here, and I wish I could be here in person, but it's really an honor and a delight to be able to attend your conference, even by Zoom. So delighted to meet you all, and I hope we can have a good discussion after I finish speaking. Perhaps I should start by saying I've been working on gender and technology for many decades, and for a long time, somehow it wasn't such an interesting topic. People weren't taking an interest. And what's amazing now is how there's a whole kind of like new generation and new interest in this topic. It seems like everyone is interested in issues of diversity. I was in Silicon Valley a couple of years ago, and it was a big issue in Silicon Valley, the lack of diversity among tech workers. We've just published a report at the Alan Turing Institute on the lack of women in AI, which we published on International Women's Day this year, and the government was very interested, and there was a lot of sort of conversation about it. And this is just a cartoon that was in our report, just kind of making fun of, the issue, what do you bring to this company? It's an all-male company, and there's a woman being interviewed. So it's great the issue is on the agenda. Our report is a very detailed report on the figures, mapping, women's position in the labour market in data science and artificial intelligence. But I just wanted to quickly pull out a couple of figures of interest. I mean, one is, and it's very hard to get these figures, but if you look at Facebook, Google, and what are called now the sort of big five companies in Silicon Valley, you'll see that there really are still predominantly men, that there's very few women in these companies. And if you look at figures like how many women are contributing to the sort of major, what are now called machine learning conferences, the big part of artificial intelligence is now machine learning. And this is a sort of global figure on the gender imbalance in who is contributing to conference papers in these main machine learning conferences. And again, you'll see there are very few women regardless of the country. So, I wanted to start off with just a few figures saying how poorly women and other, I should say, and other marginalized groups are actually in the leading sort of areas of artificial intelligence, data science, robotics, all of these things. So we know that basically it's an old story, but we're now doing new surveys of the demographics to see this. At the same time, when there's a great awareness of the lack of diversity in the industry, there's been a lot of publicity about bias in algorithmic systems. I just want to quickly give you a few examples of this. I mean, this is actually, I think, off the cover of Sophia Noble's book. algorithms of oppression. Google have changed this now, but quite a few people did work on the Google algorithm that does auto-suggest, so that when you type things into the search engine, certain things come up. And this was her looking at the kind of race and gender profile if you did a search at this time. Many of you may have seen a fantastic UNESCO report that came out a couple of years ago called I'd Blush If I Could, which tested virtual assistants like Siri and Alexa and asked them various questions, and you can see what they answered. And I read recently actually that one of these companies actually made sure that feminism didn't come up if you asked Alexa what she was. And then, of course, what's really been grabbing the headlines recently are these sort of examples. I mean, up in the left-hand side, as some of you will know, artificial intelligence is being used more and more for recruitment practices, and Amazon had a recruitment tool that basically sent ads to well-paid technical jobs more frequently to men than to women. And there's quite a lot of work going on now about hiring systems and the racism and gendering of these hiring systems. The middle example is the Apple Card, that when Apple Card first came on the market, unfortunately, Steve Wozniak, who's literally, one of the people who invented Apple, found that his wife had a much lower credit score than he did, and that the algorithm had just done it on the basis of gender. There's been a lot of work on facial recognition and the racism of various facial recognition systems. And actually, I happened to be hearing a woman from Microsoft talk last night who was involved in this chatbot that Microsoft put out that within 24 hours was shouting out racial abuse. So there's lots and lots of these examples of gender, racial, of social bias in algorithms and AI. And I wanted now to talk a little bit about the work I did years ago. And, these two books of mine, where, as you can see, there's more than a 10-year gap between the first book, Feminism Confronts Technology, and my second book, Techno-Feminism, was an attempt to sort of theorize these questions, to think through how do we think about the relationship between gender and technology, and to what extent is early feminist work and thinking over these issues kind of still relevant today? Are they still the same questions today, or are the questions a bit different? And when we started then, we were thinking about these sort of questions. And I guess I should say as well that the title of my talk is, in a way, summarizes the change in feminist work from looking at women and technology to looking at gendered technoscience, right? And you can see that in a way in the title of the second book, Techno-Feminism. So these are some of the questions we were this is how we got to the position of thinking about gender as actually being embedded in technology. We started off with questions like, does the problem lie in men's monopoly of technology? Or is there something about technology itself that's inherently gendered, right? Can technology liberate women? Is technology going to free women? Or are technologies going to reinforce sexual divisions in society? And I, as I'm going to say in a minute, characterize some of the shift as being from a kind of pessimistic position in the 1980s, I think, and I include myself in this, to more an optimism that came about with the beginning of digital technologies in the 1990s. And I think about our current thinking about gender and technology in terms of mutual shaping, if you like, the mutual shaping of gender and technology. Okay, so let me just sort of begin here. When we first started our work, one of the main things we had to do really, a picture's disappeared, I don't know why. Anyway, one of the main things we had to do for a start was to really think about, well, what is technology? Is there something inherent in the identification between men and machines. And so a lot of people have done historical work looking at the early ENIAC computers, for example, and showing that actually there's a long history of women being involved in computing, that there's nothing inherent in this identification of women and technology. There's nothing biological about it. That what's important to recognize is the historical and cultural specificity of this. So I'm sure you've all seen that, you know, one of the heroines that's been recovered from the history of gender and technology is Ada Lovelace, who in fact was one of the very first, has been recalled as the first woman computer programming from the beginning of computer programming. So we did a lot of this recovering women from the history of computing. There's a lot of projects that I've been involved with as well, with Wikipedia, trying to make sure the number of women scientists and women technologies on Wikipedia has increased. And for some years now, in Britain, for example, and I'm sure this has been the case in Europe, and forgive me, I don't know, but in Britain we have an annual Ada Lovelace Day where women get together and run a hackathon where they put more women scientists and physicists and biologists onto Wikipedia to try and even out the entries in Wikipedia as a source of knowledge. So even though we've been involved in all these things for a very long time, what we found, and forgive me, this is American figures, but it's pretty typical, is that actually over the last 50 years, the number of women in computer science has actually declined. Now, even though there's a long history of women being involved in technology, the number of women seems to have declined and continues to decline. That this is still a problem I have to say that if you'd asked me about 20, 30 years ago, I would have thought was a problem that we would have finished with, if you like. And this, and reflecting on this has led many of us to start thinking about technology in broader terms, to think about technology not so much in terms of actual artifacts, if you like, and physical objects, but also to think about technology, or as we now say, technoscience, because we now think about technology and science as very much related to each other, as thinking about technoscience much more as a culture now, right? This was a kind of big move in our thinking. And thinking about technoscience as a culture, as something that's got meaning, as something that's semiotic, allowed us to really think about the ways in which technology is integral to the constitution of our very identities, that masculinity and femininity are actually constructed partly in relation to technology. I'm just going to quickly show you some slides now to kind of give you a sense of what I mean. A colleague of mine, Londa Scheibinger at Stanford, who is the UNESCO Women and STEM representative, did a survey of school children at some point and found that if you ask school children still to draw a picture of what the typical scientist looks like, you get Einstein. You get a caricature of Einstein, basically a male scientist. Here's a picture of early hackers, and as we know, there's a long history of hobbyists, of men's clubs after schools, of this association being kind of a very strong one. If you look at a lot of early conferences on technology like this one, you actually had a pole dancing robot, which shows you again the kind of male culture that was very much there at the beginning of computing. I'm sure many of you have seen the Social Network film, and I have to say that it was a real eye-opener to me when I saw it, because I hadn't known that Facebook had started as a rating system about how pretty girls were at Harvard. I hadn't known that Zuckerberg's first card had said, "I'm CEO, bitch." So I think these things are very important to kind of recall in terms of thinking about, what I would call, if you like, kind of geek culture, that there are these exclusionary cultures and masculine defaults, that this picture is of a Hollywood series that was on television called Silicon Valley. And as you'll see, the pictures are always somehow of geeks, that there is this kind of notion, I mean, people have written about it recently in terms of bro grammar, you know, this macho culture, a kind of geek culture that we now very much associate with high tech. Now, it's very important to say that this geek culture is not universal, right? There's a lot of countries, whether it's, you know, the Philippines or in China, in Taiwan, there are a lot of countries where actually a lot of, and in Eastern Europe, where there's a long history of women engineers, of women doing maths and science. But what I think one can say is that certainly in contemporary Western society, there does seem to be a strong cultural association between, you know, masculinity and technology. So if you think about, and this is very schematically, right? I mean, I talk about this a lot in my book, Techno-Feminism, and this is very, very schematic. I mean, when people look at the history of theories of gender and technology, it's very broadly put into a kind of chronological history of kind of liberal feminism, radical and socialist feminism, if you like, and, you know, postmodern cyber feminism. And all of these strains, I think, are very interlocking. It's not like one followed the other, and there were lots of combinations of them. But just to give you an overall sense, I just want to quickly talk about this history, just to give you a flavor of where we've come from in terms of this history and where we're going and how relevant it is. I mean, if you think back to the 1980s, what was very important in radical and socialist feminism of that time was a shift from a kind of liberal feminist notion that the problem was a deficit in women, right? That women were the problem, women lacked confidence. What we needed to do was increase the number of women in STEM and to give women access to what we thought of was a neutral, objective science and technology, and that we would sort of solve the problem by doing this. And the radical shift of the 1980s, if you like, was to think much more about the gendered nature of technology itself. And I was very influenced by a book by Sandra Harding called The Science Question in Feminism that came out in 1986. It was a fabulous book. And she talked about, to quote her, she says, feminist criticisms of science evolved from asking the woman question in science to asking the more radical science question in feminism. Rather than asking how women can be more equitably treated within and by science, the question became how a science apparently so deeply involved in distinctly masculine projects could possibly be used for emancipatory ends. And I took up her challenge and started thinking about, well, how would we do a feminist analysis of technology to shift the focus from women's access to technology to looking at the very way in which technology is developed and used, and how really gender is constitutive of technology. So what we were doing really was shifting the spotlight onto artifacts themselves and thinking about how technology reflects gender divisions and inequalities. So this was a very kind of important move, if you like. It was thinking about gender power relations as really being embedded within technoscience. Now, my background was very much in socialist feminism. I was involved in studies of women's work and women's technology. I began really thinking about technology as social when we were discussing the class relations of production. And socialist feminists did a lot of work looking at the history of the labor movement and the extent to which women were excluded from various skilled trades. And I have to say that the tone of the early work in the 1980s, and I include my own book, Feminism Confronts Technology, was rather pessimistic about what was then the microelectronic revolution, right? It's the revolution before the digital revolution. We thought actually what we could see was that these new technologies were reproducing the sexual division of labour. We're embedding the sexual division of labour. And if you like, what was new in the 1990s was a new generation of feminists, cyborg feminists, cyber feminists, who responded to the digital technologies and were very much optimistic about the possibilities of technology freeing women. One of the prominent British advocates of this was Sadie Plant, who was very enthusiastic about cyberspace, the virtuality of cyberspace, that somehow this would free women, that we could be anyone we wanted on the internet. You remember that early work, you know, that the internet was postmodernist. I remember Sherry Turkle talking about this. You could be anybody you want in cyberspace. You're no longer limited by your physical body, and that these technologies somehow could free women. There was a lot of optimism about new technologies, digital technologies freeing women. And the feminist theorist who's best known really in this genre is Donna Haraway, who's really known as the, you know, the best known post-feminist gender and technology studies person, if you like. And what was very influential was her notion of a cyborg. And many of you, I'm sure, have read the Cyborg Manifesto, which was a very important text for me, where she very much said, look, we can't go back to nature. We can't just reject technology. There is no natural. And she does this critique of what she calls the Eco-Feminist Goddess, right? This notion that we can just ditch technology, reject technology, and go back to nature, to a natural world. She says these are very false boundaries. These boundaries between nature and culture, as if they're separate things, and human and machines, are very artificial. And she very radically says that she would rather be a cyborg than an eco-feminist goddess. So what she's saying really is that part of our embodiment now are technologies, that we should take on these technologies, and that these technologies can be liberating. There's no reason why we can't use these technologies for liberation. But she's also very, very careful, and I want to stress this, she's very careful to still be hypercritical, right? So it's not like she wants to say that the technologies we have at the moment are liberating, but she says there is liberating potentials in the technology. And so I often quote this sentence of hers, which I like and has been my standby sentence. The issue is no longer whether to accept or oppose technoscience, right? The issue is no longer whether to accept or oppose technoscience, but rather how to engage strategically with technoscience while at the same time being its chief critic. And I think this is what the new generation of feminists working on technology are doing, engaging with technoscience critically, and that's the position I like to take on. So two things quickly, actually, I want to stress. One is that she's very then against a simple, being positive technology, being negative about technology, but saying let's actually engage with technology strategically. She was also very against what I might think about as gender essentialism, or is now much more thought about in terms of taking on intersectionality, that she very much stressed differences between women, that all women weren't the same. And now within feminist work generally, as I'm sure you're all very aware, intersectionality has become a very important theme, and that we're all now much more aware than we were once, that there are differences between women, that there are multiple sources of discrimination, and those circles there are sort of an attempt to look at those intersections, if you like. Okay, so there now are a whole generation, a new generation of what I think about as feminist STS scholars. A lot of feminists, young feminists, have been trained in science and technology studies. There's a lot of activist programs, as you know. Some of you may have seen the film that's now on Netflix, Coded Bias, which is about facial recognition by some women at MIT. There's lots of campaigns now, like the Algorithmic Justice League, a lot of activity around gender and race bias. There's fantastic books coming out all the time. I very much like Programmed Inequality by Hicks, who's talking about the history of women in programming. And these two books at the top are fantastic, Data Feminism and Invisible Women, both very much looking at the way that the data that is fed into science and into machine learning, how the very data carries social biases. And what that means is that if you put data in that's biased, you'll get machine learning algorithms coming out the other end that are biased. And in fact, there's now a lot of discussion within the technology community itself, if you like, about fairness in algorithms. There's now a whole conference called FAT, which is about fairness in algorithms and machine learning, where technologists are trying to figure out, is there a way of defining fairness? Is there a way of making sure that the algorithms that are feeding into machine learning don't carry social biases? And a lot of discussion about, I mean, it's a very complicated issue, but a lot of discussion really about whether fixing this issue is a technical issue, whether there is really a technical solution to this problem, or whether this is a much broader social problem that can't be fixed merely by technical solutions. But I would say that in the last, particularly 5 years or so, there's much, much more recognition of the social nature of technology, if you like. And I was very struck listening to Dennis Hassabis, who is the head of DeepMind in London, which has been bought by Google, but which is the biggest artificial intelligence corporation in London, absolutely very, very influential. And I was very struck that even Dennis Hassabis, who runs DeepMind, is very aware now that values of technology. He says here technology is a learning system, and he's particularly talking about the machine learning that's used in artificial intelligence. So inevitably, it will bear some imprint of the value system and culture of the designer. So I'm sort of very happy that after 30, 40 years of sort of talking about the values within technology, it's become much more mainstream to recognize this. Okay, just quickly, a few other things. It's still the case, however, that most designers of technologies, and I'm thinking here of Silicon Valley companies, for example, when I went to visit these companies, and if you look at the figures, most of the engineers and software programmers in the big 5 companies are young men. I mean, incredibly young. Like the average age in Google is something like 30 or 32. Absolutely young men. And a colleague of mine, Sarah Sharma, actually in Canada, who's a communication scholar, produced this wonderful image where she does a very nice take on the fact that of how much people's experience affects what they think of designing. And she's basically sort of saying here that actually a lot of the apps that young men think of designing in Silicon Valley are apps to do the work that their mothers are used to doing, vacuum cleaners or whatever it is, that they very much want everything delivered, food delivered, laundry delivered, all of the kind of domestic work delivered that they were used to their kind of mothers doing. I've got a last image before my conclusion, and actually this is inspired by a art exhibition I saw a few years ago in Barcelona, actually, that was about cyborgs, machines and human beings, and what the relationship with it was. And it was at a gallery called CCCB that you probably know in Barcelona. And it just had this wonderful image, really, of a cradle being rocked by a machine. And I was very struck by how different this image was to a lot of the images that I was looking at from Japan that were very much imagining companionable, sexy robots, that would dance with people, that would be a good friend to people. Whereas here we have a very simple technology. And I'm very struck as well by the fact that the technology being used here is a cradle, which is an invention that's about 500 years old, and that a lot of old technologies are still in use and very important, and that we don't think about them. And that whenever we have these conversations about technology, all we think about is the latest and the most exciting, and we don't really think about all of the technologies of everyday life. I mean, I'm sitting in my kitchen, which is full of domestic technologies. You know, our everyday lives are completely integrated with kind of masses of technologies, and yet we always focus on the new. And I have a sense that Silicon Valley wants us to keep focusing on the new and producing a market for the new, where actually a lot of old technologies have been very useful and very good and are worth sustaining. So I kind of very much picked up this image from the exhibition. The image was called, actually, this one of the cradle, optimizing motherhood, which I thought was very nice and ironic in terms of how much Silicon Valley technologies are sold in terms of optimizing time. And I've written a few articles recently about scheduling technologies on Google and Microsoft. You know, how digital calendars, if you like, that we've all got on our phones and computers are being optimized with artificial intelligence on the basis that these technologies will save us time by having us better organized. And I have a lot to say about that anyway, but I haven't got time to sort of go into that here. So let me just go to my concluding slide, really. What I tried to argue in the Feminist Technoscience book, and I still strongly argue, and I hope I've convinced you of it in this talk, is that to think about the feminist politics of technology and science, of technoscience, is not only an equal opportunity issue, but also fundamentally a matter of how the world we live in is designed and for whom. And my friend Sally Wyatt in Maastricht puts it like this. I mean, it's a matter of social justice and fairness, providing women and other marginalized groups with equal access to interesting, well-paid jobs, education, you know, data science, as we've argued in our report at the Turing Institute that we just published. Data science and artificial intelligence on all predictions are a huge field of well-paid and interesting jobs that are going to expand. I mean, everyone's worried about the future of jobs. This is an area that we know is going to expand, and yet women and other marginalized groups at the moment have a very small share of these jobs. So in terms of fairness and social justice, it's very important that these new fields have got equal representatives of people. But it's also a matter of, if you like, epistemic justice, meaning it's in terms of kind of knowledge and understanding, that if we have a wider range of perspectives and experiences actually represented in this work amongst designers, programmers, scientists, we're bound to have better and more exclusive science and technology. So I think I see these things are very interrelated, and in our report we talk about there being a feedback loop, if you like, that if you only have a particular group of people designing technologies, then that's going to be reflected in the kinds of technologies that you produce. And if you have a wider range of experience and people represented in the making of science and technology, you're bound to have more inclusive technology. So we see these things as very interrelated, these two aspects. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judy. I think Eva is going to help us. Yes, please, Eva. Eva is one person in our team. She's a psychologist. Okay, and she's going to help us with the questions.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Ms. Wacjman.
Yeah.
I've been very impressed by this, factor that interacts with technology, which is intersectional bias.
Yep.
Because I have been thinking that obviously gender is an element which we are more used to study, but maybe some other intersectional elements are not that studied or not that included in our studies. So in the same way, we think women should be more present in research. Do you think it would be useful to include some other perspectives, such as race, or class, or capabilities, people with different capabilities, and so try to include different people from different vulnerable groups in the research field?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for asking that. I mean, it's very striking to me that the best places now that are carrying out research on, you know, bias in artificial intelligence and robotics and all these things are kind of run by women and often by Black women. I mean, I happened to see a discussion last night, I mean, on Zoom, you know, we're all watching Zoom, and it was about race in AI, and there were just fantastic Black scholars, two of them women, one of them Sophia Noble, but there was another woman, it's terrible, I can't remember her name because I don't know her, but you know, they both talked about the fact that they had been working in you know, they're Black women, they'd been working in companies, and one of them had been working on facial recognition software, and had just become aware doing that work that her face wasn't coming up as well as other people's faces, you know, that it's partly their experience was a sort of double experience, that they were very aware of feminist issues. And I think particularly it's been an amazing 12 months in terms of the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. I think both of these things I never would have dreamt myself, you know, like I just, as an old feminist, I just thought the Me Too movement, I never thought I would see that. It is so raised people's consciousness, and Black Lives Matter as well. And so they were sort of talking about how their experience as Black women had made them very aware of these intersectional issues. Actually, as well, I think one of them was saying that when they looked at Google in the early years, Black women were so sexualized, you know, that it wasn't just a thing about black and white, but particularly the sexualization, you know, that if you looked up Black women, you got much more pornography and much more images like that. And so they were kind of very aware of that, and in terms of facial recognition. So it seems to me those issues are hugely important, and that somehow women are bringing these things to the fore. I mean, let me just say a couple of other things, right? I mean, you know, the other issue that is as old, you know, that goes back to my generation of feminists, yeah, was that very early on, people like Sandra Harding and feminist philosophers of science were looking at how a lot of medical research wasn't looking at differences between men and women. Yeah, that a lot of pain medicine and, you know, lots of diseases were tested, you know, on men, and then the medicine was given to women. Yeah, that was a huge issue in terms of science and gender and kind of testing and things, right? Now that's an old issue, and again, I think there's much, much more awareness of that now, right? And in this pandemic, there's been a lot of discussion in Britain and America and everywhere, as well, about the fact that a disproportionate number of ethnic minorities, certainly in Britain, have died of COVID, right? Hugely overrepresented. Even amongst doctors, it's amazing, even amongst English doctors, you know, far fewer white doctors have died, right, than ethnic minority doctors, right? So, I mean, there's much more now, I think, a discussion of this intersection of all of these things, that actually science isn't neutral, you know, and that we have to really think about how all of these things go together. I mean, just quickly, two other things. I mean, I think one area where there's been a lot of awareness of this has been the use of algorithms in criminal justice systems, and some of the early work was done showing that what it did was lead police to spend a lot more time in black areas in America. You know, that's because, you know, more crime was there, so the algorithm said that's where you should go. So there's been a lot of work on criminal justice. I mean, the other book I love is by Cathy O'Neill, called, what is it, Maths of Destruction, something like that. Oh, it'll come to me. Oh, there's a Cathy O'Neill and there's a Eubanks book, actually. And both of those books are much more looking at things like the credit that you get if you apply for credit in a bank, you know, social welfare, you know, that it's very much on class, right? Mortgages, that, you know, more and more these decisions are automated, right? They're talking about automated decision making and how all of these things, the Eubanks book is very much looking at how all these things reproduce poverty. Yeah, that the poorer you are, the worse, you know. So yes, I think, you know, I'm sort of very gratified by the fact that the new generation are looking at how all of these issues kind of come together. Yeah. Sorry, that's a long answer, but yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eva. There are two questions in the chat, and I will make them. First is from Carlos de Almeida, which is a researcher, is making a internship here in Carlos III, and he says, my question to speaker is about the deep and dark web. What does she think about the use of the technologies to prevent crimes against women in the dark web?
Oh God, I haven't done any work on that, I'm afraid. I mean, you know, there's a project at the Turing Institute in my group, which is about racial harassment on the web, and they are wanting to expand it to look at particularly women politicians and how they're targeted. And I mean, that's I think become much more of an issue now. I mean, I don't know about the dark web, but in general, harassment on the web is much more on the agenda than it used to be, and there's much more talk of legislation, of making it illegal to harass people. And as I say, our project is very much on racial harassment, particularly kind of Muslims in Britain. But I know that there's been a huge issue, particularly with women journalists, women politicians. Some women politicians in the last election literally said that they wouldn't run for office because they were scared, because they were getting so much harassment. And speaking of intersectionality, the woman who's politician in London who absolutely gets the most hate mail, if you like, is Diane Abbott, who is a black woman, who is Labour, black, and a woman. And she gets, I mean, actually my professor at Turing said to me, actually, if you took into account the hate mail she gets, it would probably be it would be as much as all male politicians get just at her. So I think, you know, these issues are terribly important. And, you know, the solutions to, it's very hard to know what the solutions to them are. I mean, I'm a great believer in regulation, and I'm glad there's a discussion about making these things illegal and being able to sort of trace people who are doing this and make it a legal offence. But it's, you know, I'm sure you know it's a terribly complicated issue in terms of privacy and the legality and, you know, all of these things. I mean, I think Europe is ahead of America in terms of at least having more legislation actually about the internet and privacy than is the case here and in America. But sorry, I haven't worked on that, so I haven't really got a great answer on that.
No, but it's very interesting. Thank you. Yes, I think we need more legislation, I think.
Yeah.
Well, another question from Georgiana is a sociology student from our university, and she would like to ask, what tools has sociology to erase the bias of gender in artificial intelligence?
Oh, I think we've got all the tools, actually, and I very much advocate that social scientists and humanities scholars be involved with technologists to have interdisciplinary groups. And actually at the Turing Institute, I'm part of a public policy group where we have got, you know, historians and philosophers, ethicists and sociologists in humanities. And the reason we have that group is that there's a wide recognition that we really can't do science and technology without that. And of course, one of the things Turing Institute has been very involved with in the last 12 months has been COVID, right? Has been the rollout of the testing of the of the vaccines. And as you know, there's been reticence in taking the vaccines, and that's been related to a history of a lack of trust of certain groups in science, particularly kind of ethnic minorities and Black people in Britain are more cynical for very good reasons, have got less trust in science. And so really you can't do any science and technology without, thinking, without having sociologists, demographers, who are talking to people, getting a sense of, how people think about the science, what it means to them, how it's going to be used, how to make people trust in science. Some of my colleagues are very involved in drawing up ethics policy for the government, what privacy and surveillance and, how should the government think about these things, what ethical constraints should be put on people who are doing this kind of work. When I was at Stanford, they were introducing a compulsory ethics course for all of the students doing computer science. And I know at Harvard, for a few years, there's a wonderful Professor Barbara Gross who introduced a compulsory ethics course into the computer science courses. So it seems to me, particularly sociology of science and technology is completely crucial to design and thinking about these things, and actually for giving people the tools to critically read and think about these things. I mean, I've always been a great advocate of scientists and technologists having to explain to the general public what it is they do and getting feedback from the general public about what they're about to do, whether it's, if you think about the government setting up committees on genetically modified tomatoes, or, issues about sort of pollution, or, science and technology is sort of everything. It's what we eat and, our mobile phones and, absolutely everything, tracking data. And all of these things citizens very much want to know about, being involved with, be fully informed. And I think it's the responsibility on us social scientists to educate people about this, but also a big responsibility on scientists and technologists to make their work accessible and transparent. And the government's got a crucial role to play in making sure that that happens. Yes?
Sorry, very interesting, very interesting. Excuse me, I have the micro off. We have 3 more questions. One is from Jose Miranda, also from the research team of our group, and he says, how can we really handle gender-specific products, technological ones, that reinforce sex stereotypes? From a technological perspective, do you think big companies are really taking into consideration gender perspective to design their products? Should the companies have a specific department team specialized to deal with this?
I think, and I know that these discussions are going on in these companies, but what the problem is how secretive these companies are, right? So I know, for example, that after the UNESCO report came out about Siri, I blush if I could, that there have been a lot of discussions in the companies about whether virtual assistants should have female voices or male voices. And I gather they had a conversation about maybe the voices should be gender neutral, that they should make up voices where you couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. So, I mean, at that level, I think there's a lot of discussions, and certainly I'm sure you've all followed the business about a couple of people recently being fired from Google over the facial recognition issue. And some states have now, I think California, or maybe it's just San Francisco, have literally banned the police using facial recognition, right? So, I mean, because of the racism. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion going on in Silicon Valley about these issues, but they're going on in secret, in private, because you know, as soon as these issues come up, I mean, sort of let me give you an example with the Google search engine, right? I mean, the minute the issue came up that the search engine, if you put, you know, like 7 years ago or something, if you put in physicist into Google, you would get just male white men, photos of white men, right? Now, I mean, you know, there's a lot of very smart people at Google, the smartest, so they very quickly fixed it, right? And now if you go in, you see black men and women physicists, yeah? Some problems are like that, are sort of easy to fix, and the companies respond very quickly to those kind of problems. So the voice thing, there's lots of problems that they can respond to quickly and easily, and they try and do that. What's much more difficult, and I think this is probably what I'm being asked, is the extent to which these issues can really be solved when they're related to what we call the business model of these companies, right? That basically the issue about tracking data, which is a huge issue in Facebook, right, is one that they are absolutely trying to avoid as best they can, because they collect the data to maximize advertising revenue, that they're basically an advertising company. They need to collect the data, and the more data they've got, the better they can target ads. So those sort of issues, I think, are very hard to tackle and really will need national governments to sort of try and rein in those issues. Again, I think the companies vary a lot, so that, you know, Apple makes products, and so it's very easy for Apple to do lots of things in a way that Facebook completely relies on advertising, so is more limited. So I think it's hard to generalize across the companies. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are taking these issues more seriously than others. And in some of the companies, which has been a wonderful thing, there have been internal protests. You know, there have been workers inside these companies saying that they don't want to work on military contracts, for example, that they don't want some of their technology like facial recognition being used against immigrants. You know, so you know, the more we push from the outside, if you like, it more encourages people inside, I think, to kind of take up these issues. I mean, I think the last thing I'd say about this is that all of the big companies now have got ethics boards, right? They've all got ethics boards. There's a huge collection of these ethics boards called the AI Partnership, which is a partnership of all of the big companies, you know, talking about ethical standards. And, you know, there's a lot of differing opinion about how seriously they're taking these ethics boards, or to what extent the ethics boards are an attempt by these companies to avoid legislation, government legislation. So, you know, it's you know, in a way, we're just at the beginning, I think, of these discussions, and we'll see. I mean, they are very powerful, these companies, so it's hard to take them on. But I mean, certainly, I think even Biden getting elected now is kind of scaring some of them in terms of legislation.
Okay, thank you. We have one question that will be done directly by the researcher, that is Irene Del Amo, also from our research. Irene, if you want, please.
Oh, thank you.
Hi.
Thank you, Celia.
Hello.
Hello. So first of all, thank you for your inspiring lecture. It has been really, really interesting. So in recent years, there is a debate in the legal world about the use of predictive justice and algorithms to deliver judgments. So in formal questions, you have pointed out, but could you go deeper into this topic?
Yes, I think, no, I think in terms of judgments, what's really, really important is that automated decision-making is presented as being objective, neutral, and unbiased. That's what's key, right? Yeah. So that when I've argued with people who are, you know, there's a very well-known book here by a guy called Richard Susskind, right? Susskind, which is all about law and decision-making, right? He is a great advocate of using automated decision, automated thing. And he says to me, I've been on debates with him, and he says to me, Judy, he says, after lunch, the judge has had a drink at lunchtime and he's not making very good decisions, yeah? And so wouldn't it be better if a machine makes the decision and not the judge, yeah? As if I think, and I say to him, wouldn't it be better if the judge didn't drink at lunchtime? That also would be a solution to this problem, right? Now, of course, there's a lot of bias in terms of human bias in terms of judges. It would also help if in Britain, most high court judges weren't upper class white men, right? That's also the case, that if judges were more representative. But to think that a solution to a long social problem, which is that one, is machines, is very naive. And with all of these things, my thought would be that we should use machines to augment our knowledge, right? That it isn't that a decision-making machine should replace us. I mean, obviously, it's better for a judge to have as much information as possible, right? So it would be great if you were still a human being, but you've got this fantastic data that you never had before on, the average crime statistics and da-da-da-da-da, but that you still, as a human being, have discretion when making a decision. And what machines will never do is have discretion. We'll really look at the person, think about the social circumstances in a broader way, and then make a decision. And there's a lot of very good pieces being written now about, that artificial intelligence isn't intelligence at all, right? That they talk about, I mean, I mentioned this somewhere, but other people have written much better about it, that they use these metaphors like machine learning as if a machine learns like a human being. They use artificial intelligence as if intelligence is the same as human, thing. They always talk about neural networks as if it's the brain. I mean, these are very narrow conceptions of what intelligence is, what learning is, And again, to the previous person, I mean, you need sociologists, ethicists, humanists to always be saying, look, actually, this is a very narrow definition of the problem. And just to go back to the slide I showed on fairness, I mean, I'm very skeptical about there being a technical solution to algorithmic bias, right? It seems to me it's a very deep social problem, and that no amount of fiddling around with a technical formula, when you put the data in, is going to kind of fix this up, right? And it's also partly about what Eugenie Morozov talked about, wrote a book, terrific book years ago called Technological Solutionism, right? That we live in this sort of culture where we think every social problem has got a technical solution. And Silicon Valley want us to think that every problem has got a technical solution. And actually, when I was doing my interviews with engineers in Stanford, they believe that there is a technical problem, a technical solution to every problem. They genuinely believe this. And we need to educate them to see that this is not the case, that there are lots of things that are social problems that need social solutions. So, sorry, it's again a long answer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been really, really clear. So thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you, Judy. We have a question from Gemma Valencia, and she would like to ask the question. Following. Are the post-humanist theories, as Barat proposed, a useful approach to analyze technologies from a socio-technological approach, especially with algorithms and related technologies?
I'm not very fond of post-humanist work myself. I mean, I come very much from science and technology studies, and I very much like the work. I like sort of our approach, and much more, as I said, thinking about science and technology as kind of socio-technical. Yeah, that we always really think about, society and technology is kind of mutually shaped. That technology is really frozen social relations. I sort of think it's a better way to think about these things very concretely, to look at the way, you know, technology is shaped into, you know, that we do sort of much more kind of concrete empirical studies looking at how technologies are designed, you know, how they're kind of used afterwards, whether there are different ways of using technologies that weren't predicted by designers, that there are a whole lot of tools, I think, in the science and technology studies kind of tool book, if you like, that lots of, as I said, you know, people at terrific institutes now, and, you know, when I say this, I'm thinking about institutes like the AI Now Institute in New York, Data and Society, Algorithmic Justice League. There's a lot of terrific centres now doing this critical work, and I'm much more sympathetic to this. I mean, there are various different kinds of kind of post-humanists, I know, and some of them, you know, do think that we're living in some new era where machines are going to be better than us or more intelligent than us, and we're going to merge into them. And I'm not very sympathetic to that kind of literature. Personally, myself, lots of other people are, but I'm not.
Okay, thank you very much, Judy. I don't know what happened with your camera that is switched off now. We are
My
not,
camera, is it?
We are not able to see you now, but only from 2 minutes ago.
Oh, I don't know. I really don't know why that is, because it's my machine says I'm sharing the video.
Okay, okay.
So I don't know what that is. It literally says others can see your video.
Okay, but well,
So
I think
I'm
we
lost.
can continue. No, it's okay. It's okay. We are hearing you. I think it's a problem of Blackboard. It's a platform that is making bad things, I think. I don't know if anybody has more questions. If no, I have one question. Yeah, okay, Eva, please, Eva. Eva, you can ask.
Sorry, it was my micro. I just wanted to say thank you and also give you some positive feedback about what you've just said about how we trust in technology just to solve all our problems, whereas the solution is just in our hand and in our way of see and understand our reality. And I think that's the main problem, that we keep trusting technology, but we should trust more in our criticism, let's say, or our way to see that we are not doing it very well, and the relationships are not very equal. So we should work more on that side of the problem instead of just trusting technology. So thank you for your speech related to that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I have one question. If nobody is going to ask more, I have one question. When you say, Judy, you said that microelectronics technology seems to reinforce the sexual division.
Yeah.
And I wonder why. If you could explain more that, because I would like to, because I am a microelectronics engineer, so I would like to know that.
Oh, I see. No, look, all I meant was that when I started working on gender and technology studies, right, at the time of the microelectronic revolution, that's how long ago I started doing this, yeah? So it was literally in the late 70s, early 80s. And if you read Marxist feminist literature at that time, we were very pessimistic. We just felt like, actually, if you looked at the labor market, that somehow the way in which the technology was introduced would not be good for women at that time, and that women would be entrenched in the same kind of jobs. So it was that sort of thought thought that, you know, it was very much looking at the labour market and the kinds of work women and men did, and that the technologies weren't going to change that. And actually the technologies didn't change that radically. You know, it's not like suddenly engineering became feminized or anything. So we were very much kind of focused on secretaries and what would happen when computers came in, and secretaries, you know, we were worried about secretaries losing all their jobs, you know, typists, you know, with that time, yeah? So we were very much thinking about that typing pools would be decimated by computers, that women would lose a lot of jobs and that they wouldn't get access to a lot of the new jobs. And it was very much thinking then about industrial technology, you know, about factories, about the earlier technologies. And all I was trying to say is that when digital technologies came in, you know, the internet was a point at which feminists became very sort of positive about technologies. They somehow thought that the internet meant that now you could be in this space where nobody could know where you were a man or a woman, that there were all these communication spaces and organization spaces, where there'd be a lot more kind of freedom to experiment with your identity and be someone else. So I was just trying to contrast the sort of earlier Marxist feminist work with some of the, you know, what's loosely called kind of cyber feminist work that came on in the 90s, the sort of optimism about digital technologies. And then, yeah, do you see what I mean? And then say really what came together out of all that was a meeting of a lot of sort of feminist work on technology with science and technology studies, if you like.
Okay.
Is that sort of clear?
Yes, it's very clear. Thank you very much, Judy. Sorry for the technical problems now with the cameras, but I think everybody is very happy of having listened to your speech and your lecture and the discussion. Thank you very much again, and I hope the next year we could meet here in Madrid.
That would be great. Okay, thank you. Lovely to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you again. Oh, we are seeing you. That's working again.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye. Lovely to see you. Bye. Good luck with the rest of the conference.
Okay, nice. Nice, thank you. We are continuing with the next panel, and we are preparing the next panel that will start at 1 o'clock.